tackling tough topics to help you think reasonably about life's most important issues. This is Thinker Sensitive. Hi, welcome back to Thinker Sensitive. My name is Ryan Ragazine, and I am the writer and the producer of the Thinker Sensitive podcast. So before we begin, I have a little household item or announcement. If you enjoyed our most recent season, and if you'd be interested in owning it in written form, we just released a graphic PDF manual that you can print out and use as reading material around your home. For more info and for all the details, you can visit one of our social media pages, whether our Facebook page, our YouTube page, our Instagram page, or all the info is covered in our weekly newsletter. So today marks the first installment of the weekly after our relaunch. So we call this segment the Weekly Podcast. The plan is that we'll release a podcast once a week with short breaks before and after a season. So I'll use a break before a season to start preparing for the season, and then I'll use a little break after the season to promote and market that season. But outside of those spaces, we plan on releasing an episode once a week called The Weekly. The first 3 weekly podcasts are going to be taken from 3 articles that I wrote last year in the midst of the George Floyd protests. Honestly, these articles could have been written at any time, as I think the content would have been relevant at any period over the last several years. Each of these articles are quite short in length, so I'm going to be adding a bit of commentary as I read them. So the idea is that I'm taking these articles and I'm augmenting and I'm updating the original material. And so the format is really going to be a kind of reading together, a communal reading that's interjected with commentary. So our first article in our podcast today is called A Prophetic Word from Martin Luther King Jr. Let's begin with the first paragraph. MLK is a kindred intellectual spirit of mine. We hold degrees in the same areas of study and specialized in the same disciplines, historical philosophy and systematic theology. We were influenced by many of the same dead white philosophers, like Locke, Kant, Kierkegaard, and Hegel, and we share the same faith. To interject here, I'm not sure that most people know how well-read MLK was. And I'm not sure that most people recognize how strongly influenced he was by both historical philosophy and historical theology. And this is something that is hard to miss when you read him. And it's something that really jumped out to me when I first encountered MLK's writings. I'm also not sure that it's possible to truly understand his message and his overall mission without understanding the nature and the character of his Christian faith, since so much of his system of thought is explicitly drawn from it. I'll give an example here. MLK was a big proponent of what he called nonviolent resistance. So you could say MLK had a program of nonviolent resistance. And yes, MLK was impacted by Gandhi here, but you could argue that he was influenced more so by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus actually served as a main source of influence for Gandhi himself. MLK said this about his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. Quote, Christ furnished the spirit and motivation, while Gandhi furnished the method. So MLK was heavily influenced by the person of Jesus Christ. One of my favorite quotes from MLK is his famous statement that reads like this: hate begets hate, violence begets violence, toughness begets a greater toughness. We must meet the forces of hate with the power of love. That quote is a direct play off of Jesus' statement that those who live by the sword will die by the sword. It's also a direct play off of Jesus' teaching to love your enemies. This idea of enemy love that is so unique to the ethical system of Jesus Christ. Jesus was, in a sense, a nonviolent resistor before it was cool. He preached against retaliation and he preached against revenge by the power of forgiveness and love. Some Christians have unfortunately failed to recognize this, which is why Gandhi himself was dismayed that many Christians throughout the history of the world were nothing like their Christ, which is an assessment that I wholeheartedly agree with. All right, let's take a look at the next paragraph. It reads, I have seen several memes and statements on social media invoking MLK during these turbulent times. Turbulent times here refers to the civil unrest during the season of 2020. Unfortunately, many of them simply play into and exacerbate the polarized thinking, rigid partisanship, and extremism that plague our society today, all of which makes civil discourse and constructive dialogue very, very difficult. Let me add some commentary here. Hermeneutics is the science and study of interpretation, particularly the interpretation of a text. One of the primary principles within the discipline of hermeneutics is the idea that context is extremely important when interpreting a piece of literature. In order to grasp the meaning of a sentence, a paragraph, or a chapter within a text, it's really important to interpret the content within the framework of the surrounding literary context. So, speaking of these notions of violence and nonviolence, pulling a quote out of its original context and severing it from its native semantic environment is a form of violence. When we do this, we're actually doing violence to the text itself. Now, this principle doesn't simply apply to texts, but it also applies to people and the words that they say. If we care about intellectual honesty, and if we care about charitable and accurate interpretations, if we care about truth, then we'll be careful not to take people's words out of context. We'll be careful not to take people's words out of the broader context of both their belief systems and their personal histories. So, for instance, when I quote MLK, if I care about truth, I think I have a responsibility to interpret his words within the context of his Christian faith and within the overarching framework of his program of nonviolent resistance. I think to take the words of MLK out of context is a kind of act of violence against the king of nonviolence. So, what I often see in our culture today, in society, on social media, is you see uncritical and uncharitable interpretations. You see people misusing and misappropriating the words of others. You see people taking quotations out of context and twisting them to mean basically whatever they want them to mean. And you see people manipulating and misapplying the words of others in order to promote their personal agendas. How many people, how many groups have used the words of MLK, a man who believed in overcoming hate with love, to promote hate, to fight hate with hate, to combat injustice with injustice? I want to read you this powerful quote from MLK again. He says, "Hate begets hate. Violence begets violence. Toughness begets a greater toughness. We must meet the forces of hate with the power of love." Now, let me be very clear. This kind of misconstrual of other people's words in order to promote a personal agenda takes place on both sides of the aisle. Anyone or any group who also uses the words of MLK to promote complacency, silence, passive acceptance, and inaction in the face of injustice also does a kind of violence to the king of nonviolence. The program of MLK that we're talking about was called nonviolent resistance for a reason. So this type of thing happens on both sides of the aisle, and it happens on both sides of the walls of the church. The way that people throughout history have treated the Bible serves as a really great example of this. Many people, including cult leaders, take verses of the Bible out of context and use them to justify their own personal beliefs and actions. Now, in the article, polarized thinking, rigid partisanship, and extremism refer mainly to unsound thinking and unsound communication. Two things that I'm going to be harping on a lot in this podcast, and two things that relate to the interpretive problems that I'm talking about here. But this also relates to character. Our character often determines our thinking, our communication, and our actions. How much of my poor thinking, my poor interpretations, my poor communication has to do with my poor character or my questionable character? I want to invoke the words of Christ from Matthew 12 here. These words of Jesus are addressed to the religious leaders of his day. He says, "Make a tree good, and its fruit will be good. Or make a tree bad, and its fruit will be bad. For a tree is recognized by its fruit. You brood of vipers, how can you who are evil say anything good? For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart. An evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in him." Let's continue with the article. The next paragraph reads, "In the midst of great divisiveness and hostility, I can't help but wonder if we, as a society, have lost the ability to have meaningful, fruitful, and respectful conversations with those who believe differently than we do. Have we lost the willingness to listen and learn from others? Are we incapable of finding common ground and pursuing unity?" To interject again here, there are a lot of things that I can say about this, and I'm going to cover a lot of these concerns in many future podcasts. But what I can say is that I'm a person who has always desired to have meaningful and fruitful conversations with people who don't see things the way that I see things. I've always desired relationship, true friendship, with people who believe differently than I do. With that said, I've also messed up a handful of times in this area. I've missed opportunities. I have had my fair share of failures when it comes to communication. But here are a few problems that I see in contemporary discourse. Number one, we want other people to agree with us or to conform to what we believe. In other words, we aren't really tolerant of and open to difference. Number two, when there is real divergence, we tend to focus all our attention on it instead of finding common ground. We have a natural tendency to seek division rather than unity. Number three, when we focus on the difference, whatever that difference might be, we do so in order to win an argument or convince the other person that they're wrong, not in order to have an actual interchange of ideas and actively listen to the other person. And the unfortunate outcome is this, that we tend to disassociate with those who disagree with us. We tend to only be friends with people who agree with us. And I would ask you this: look at your friends, look at your relationships, look at the people who are close to you and the people in your life. How many of these people are on the other side of the fence politically or religiously? If none or very few, I think that's a red flag. And I think it can say something about our tolerance level. Let's dig into the next paragraph of the article. It reads, if MLK were alive today, I think he would be greatly troubled by the state of both our thinking and our communication on a wide scale societal level. MLK was trained by dialectical philosophers and was a dialectical thinker. To put this in more accessible terms, he was a mediating thinker. He tried to find common ground between polarized viewpoints. He believed that truth was complex, not simple. He steered away from overly simplistic, black and white, either or thinking, seeking to find a synthesis out of sharp bifurcations. In ethical terms, one could say that King was a peacemaker. Okay, so some further explanation here will probably be helpful. What are we talking about when we're talking about dialectics? What is dialectical thinking? What is a dialectical method? So, I want to look at some historical examples of dialectical thinking. The first example that comes to mind would be Socrates and the Socratic method. So, Socrates was this really interesting figure who would walk around and strike up conversations with people. In these conversations, he would challenge people's presuppositions and he would introduce some novel and challenging ideas. So, in the Socratic method, we see an idea that is clarified, refined, sharpened, and nuanced through a critical dialogue between two people. So, that's one form of a dialectical method or dialectical thinking. Another example that comes to mind would be in the great scholastic thinkers of the medieval period. So you think of a figure like Thomas Aquinas, for example. In Thomas Aquinas, the dialectical method kind of is fleshed out like this. You find extreme nuance in the most intricate of details based on critical questioning, cross examination, and responding to objections, right? Responding to criticisms. So these two forms of dialectical thinking are a little bit different, but they also share some commonalities. The kind of common denominator here is that dialectical thinking involves a dialogue between two opposing viewpoints that creates great nuance. King was most notably influenced by Hegel, another great philosopher and logician in the history of philosophy. For the purposes of this podcast, I'm going to give the very basic textbook elementary explanation of Hegel's dialectic. Now, let me just say that this is an overly simplistic appropriation, and it does not do justice to the full scope of Hegel's dialectical process. Hegel's dialectic has often been characterized as a thesis, antithesis, synthesis, triadic pattern. And this pattern of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis has often been applied to history and the historical process. So when we do this, we get this idea that in history, you might have an event, a discovery, a movement that creates an era, a historical epoch. And you might call this a thesis. And then you might have in history a counter event, discovery, movement that creates a different era in history. And you might call this an antithesis. Then, finally, you might have an event, a discovery, a movement within the historical process that represents the mediation or harmony or union of the historical thesis and antithesis. And you might call this a synthesis. So let me give an example from church history. And this example from the history of Christianity relates to the ideas of violence and nonviolence that we've talked about a little bit during this podcast. So, in the primitive church, you see a strict nonviolent pacifism that often results in martyrdom. You could call that a thesis. Then, in Roman and European Christendom, you see violence and you see war, and you actually see violence being used to promote Christianity. And we can call that our antithesis. Then, in more modern forms of Christianity, you see the common application of what's known as just war theory. The idea that war is really only justified in pretty extreme situations as a last resort and as an act of self defense. And this can be interpreted as a historical synthesis of the preceding eras in Christianity. So, to sum all of this up, the main point is this. In Hegel, you have this concept of mediation between and synthesis of divergent concepts and ideas, at least in its most simple and elementary form. But in society today, don't we see a lack of willingness to identify the truth, even small nuggets of truth, in opposing viewpoints? Don't we see an unwillingness to seek mediation and to find middle ground, to compromise? Don't we see a lack of nuance that I think is exacerbated by social media and the nature of it? The peacemaker seeks mediation. The peacemaker tries to find a middle ground and is open to compromise for the sake of unity and harmony. Kind of like the role that's often played by the middle child, right? But King is a great example of this. He, in a way, is our thesis. On the other hand, our political leaders today are a great counter example of this. They, in some sense, are the antithesis. All right, let's get back to the article. It continues, here are some quotes from King himself that demonstrate his noble pursuit of mediation, unity, harmony, and peace. Quote, like the synthesis in Hegelian philosophy, the principle of nonviolent resistance seeks to reconcile the truths of two opposites, acquiescence and violence, while avoiding the extremes and immoralities of both. That's from Stride Toward Freedom. Another quote, but life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites in fruitful harmony. The philosopher Hegel said that truth is found in neither the thesis nor the antithesis, but in an emergent synthesis which reconciles the two. That's from A Tough Mind and a Tender Heart. Another quote, what I'm saying to you this morning is communism forgets that life is individual. Capitalism forgets that life is social. And the kingdom of brotherhood is found neither in the thesis of communism nor the antithesis of capitalism, but in a higher synthesis. It is found in a higher synthesis that combines the truths of both. That's from Where Do We Go From Here? The article continues. Listen to this report from an aide at the South Christian Leadership Conference staff meetings that King often facilitated. Here's the quote. He, MLK, had a remarkable facility for sitting through long, contentious meetings and then summarizing what everybody had said and synthesizing that into a conclusion that appealed to all. That skill was not happenstance, but a repeated practical application of the Hegelian method of thesis, antithesis, synthesis that King had been fascinated with and attached to ever since graduate school. Let's just continue in the article here. It says, King was not only a vocal proponent for, but an active participant in free speech, civil discourse, respectful and empathetic dialogue, active listening, critical and charitable thinking, mediation, and peacemaking. These values are fundamental to all healthy human relationships, fundamental to all constructive dialogue, and they're fundamental to a healthy society. It is hard to imagine how any societal progress can occur without them. I really don't have anything to add here, so I'm just going to move on to the next paragraph. It reads, following King's lead, I wonder if we're willing to try, even imperfectly, to take the path of mediation. Not in every instance and in all cases. This itself would actually be a form of extremism, but at least as a basic default stance. Are we willing to pursue unity, peace, harmony, and reconciliation first and foremost, rather than division and hostility? I would like to believe so, but I'm growing more and more weary and disillusioned by the day. Okay, I'm going to quickly comment on this last sentence. Like Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a famous neo-Orthodox theologian, ethicist, and political commentator, I believe that the ideal that's being portrayed in this paragraph is ultimately an impossible possibility. As a society, I don't think that we will ever reach or attain this possible reality in human history. To me, all forms of utopianism are forms of naivety and don't take the witness of human history very seriously. I do believe, however, like Niebuhr, that a realistic understanding of human nature on both an individual and corporate level should not prevent us from trying our best to live out and live into these values, to live like such impossible things are possible. The final paragraph of the article reads like this. I hope my skepticism is off-based. I hope this cynical spirit that resides in my heart is misguided. I hope that this spirit of mediation, which once resided in Martin Luther King Jr., is not dead. Does it still reside in me? Does it reside in you? Can it reconcile us in the midst of our differences? Will it ultimately lead us past our discord and our contentiousness to a novel future of peace and unity? I hope so. To conclude today's weekly podcast, I want to highlight the nature of my hope. I hope for what is impossible in the finite, but possible in eternity. I hope for what is impossible in history, but possible in its consummation. I hope for what's impossible for earthly kingdoms, but possible in the kingdom. My hope is not in humanity, but in God. It's not in myself, but in transcendent spirit, the spirit of novelty, the spirit of the future, the spirit of love and unity, the unifying unity of all things, who seeks to harmonize all things in Christ. This is the Christian hope. It's a hope of the future that should profoundly influence the way that I live in the here and now. This was also the hope of Martin Luther King Jr., and such a Christian hope informed his entire program throughout the history of his life, which is why trying to understand MLK's program without understanding his Christianity is not something that I would personally advise. As always, thanks for listening. This episode, and all episodes of Thinker Sensitive, are available at thinkersensitive.com, iTunes, Spotify, and more. If you enjoy our content and wish to donate to help us grow our online community of thinkers, please visit thinkersensitive.com.